Have you ever watched a child struggle in school while expensive tutors made things worse instead of better? This millionaire father spent $540,000 on 6 elite tutors to help his son who'd been labeled hopeless by the education system, and every single one of them failed. Contrary to what most people believe, the person who finally unlocked this 8-year-old's potential wasn't a PhD from Harvard or a specialist from Yale. It was a black cleaning lady who understood that sometimes the most profound learning happens with the simplest tools. I've researched hundreds of cases where expensive educational interventions fail struggling children. But this story reveals something that will change how you think about learning labels and the power of believing in a child's potential. By the end of this story, you'll understand why a $3 children's book accomplished what $500,000 in specialized tutoring couldn't, and how one woman's patience and wisdom transformed a hopeless child into an honor roll student. Monique Johnson went from being dismissed as unqualified to the teacher who proved that every child can learn when someone believes in them enough to find the right key to unlock their potential. If you skip this story, you'll miss the moment that shows why love and patience are more powerful than any expensive educational method, and how the right person with the right heart can see possibilities where experts see only problems. The Hamilton Mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, looked like something from an architectural magazine, with its Georgian columns and manicured grounds that spoke of success measured in millions. But inside the mahogany-paneled study on the second floor, 8-year-old Tyler Hamilton sat surrounded by educational materials that cost more than most families' annual income. His small shoulders hunched in defeat as he stared at workbooks that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Have you ever felt like no matter how much money you throw at a problem, it only seems to get worse? David Hamilton, a self-made real estate mogul who had built his fortune by turning failed properties into luxury developments, found himself facing the one challenge that his wealth and determination couldn't solve: helping his son learn to read. Tyler had been diagnosed with a complex combination of learning disabilities that made traditional education feel like an impossible mountain to climb. Severe dyslexia made letters swim and dance on the page. ADHD made focusing on tasks feel like trying to catch butterflies with his bare hands, and processing delays meant that by the time he understood one instruction, 3 more had been given. The public school system had been the first to give up on Tyler, recommending him for special education classes after he'd struggled through first grade without mastering basic reading skills. The private school that David had enrolled him in next had been more diplomatic but equally discouraging, suggesting that Tyler might be better served by a specialized facility for children with significant learning challenges. The word hopeless had never been spoken directly to David's face, but it hung in the air during every parent-teacher conference, every educational assessment, every well-meaning suggestion that perhaps Tyler's goals should be adjusted to realistic expectations. David had refused to accept those limitations for his son. If Tyler needed more help than traditional schools could provide, then David would hire the best educational specialist that money could buy. Dr. Sarah Mitchell from Harvard had been the first expert recruited a learning specialist with a PhD in educational psychology and a client list that included senators' children and technology executives' offspring. Her $15,000 monthly fee had seemed reasonable for someone with her credentials and success rate. For 4 months, Dr. Mitchell had implemented structured learning protocols designed to retrain Tyler's brain to process information more efficiently. The sessions had been conducted with scientific precision, utilizing cutting-edge educational technology and evidence-based interventions that had helped hundreds of children overcome similar challenges. But Tyler had grown more anxious and withdrawn, with each appointment, his natural curiosity suffocating under the weight of constant assessment and correction. Professor James Chen from Yale had been brought in next, a reading expert whose revolutionary phonics program had been featured in educational journals worldwide. His $12,000 monthly program promised to teach any child to read using neurological mapping techniques and intensive sound symbol association training. Tyler had endured 6 weeks of daily sessions that felt more like medical procedures than learning experiences, sitting in a sterile room while Professor Chen drilled him on letter combinations and phonetic patterns that seemed to dissolve in his mind the moment they were introduced. Dr. Rebecca Foster had approached Tyler's challenges from a behavioral perspective, charging $18,000 per month to implement ADHD management protocols that combine medication adjustments with structured reward systems designed to improve focus and compliance. Her method required Tyler to earn points for sitting still, paying attention, and completing tasks within specified time limits. The behavioral approach had turned learning into a performance that Tyler felt he was constantly failing each session, ending with charts that documented his deficits rather than celebrating any progress he might have made. Ms. Patricia Walsh had been recruited from one of Manhattan's most exclusive private schools, bringing with her the teaching methods that had produced generations of Ivy League students. Her $10,000 monthly fee included access to educational resources that money usually couldn't buy, personalized curriculum materials, one-on-one instruction, and the kind of academic rigor that prepared students for the most competitive schools in the country. But Tyler wasn't competing for Ivy League admission. He was fighting just to recognize the difference between B and SCI, and Ms. Walsh's high-pressure approach only highlighted how far behind he was compared to his peers. Dr. Michael Torres had been David's most expensive gamble, a neurological learning expert whose $20,000 monthly program utilized brain imaging and cognitive training to address learning disabilities at their neurological source. Tyler had undergone extensive testing that revealed the specific ways his brain processed information differently, followed by computer-based training designed to strengthen weak neural pathways. The scientific approach had been fascinating to David but torturous for Tyler, who spent hours each week connected to machines that monitored his brain activity, while he struggled through exercises that felt nothing like the joy of discovery that learning was supposed to provide. Ms. Jennifer Park had been the final attempt before David considered more drastic measures. Her advanced Montessori training and $14,000 monthly fee had promised to honor Tyler's individual learning style, while gently guiding him toward academic success through child-led exploration and discovery. But even the gentlest approach had failed when Tyler's confidence had been so thoroughly shattered by months of being measured against standards he couldn't meet, evaluated by methods he couldn't understand, and taught by people who saw his struggles as problems to be solved rather than differences to be celebrated. After 6 months and $540,000 in specialized tutoring, Tyler was further behind academically than when they'd started, and infinitely further behind emotionally. The bright, curious boy who had once asked endless questions about how things worked had been replaced by a defeated child who believed that learning was something other people could do, but he couldn't. Standing in his study that October evening, watching Tyler push away yet another workbook, with tears of frustration in his eyes, David Hamilton realized that all his money and all his determination had succeeded only in convincing his son that he was as hopeless as everyone seemed to believe. Monique Johnson had been cleaning office buildings and luxury homes for 3 years, ever since budget cuts had eliminated her position as a third-grade teacher in Newark's public school system. At 45, she'd spent 20 years in classrooms where resourcefulness mattered more than resources, where she'd learned to help struggling students with patience, creativity, and the unshakable belief that every child could learn if someone cared enough to find the right approach. How many of us have had our potential overlooked because we didn't fit into someone else's definition of qualified? Monique understood that some of the most important teaching happened outside formal educational settings, in moments when children felt safe enough to take risks and make mistakes without being judged or measured. Her evening cleaning route included the Hamilton mansion twice a week, a job that paid better than most and allowed her to work around her morning shift at a local diner. She'd been cleaning David's home office for 6 months, arriving after business hours when the house was quiet and the family had finished their dinner. Monique had noticed Tyler during her first week on the job, a small boy who spent evenings in his father's study surrounded by educational materials that would have impressed any teacher but seemed to overwhelm the child who was supposed to benefit from them. She'd observed him during her cleaning routine, noting the way his shoulders tensed when he opened workbooks, the defeated slump of his posture, when he encountered words he couldn't read, and the quick way he'd close books when adults approached. Her teacher's eye had recognized the signs immediately. Tyler wasn't lazy or defiant. He was a bright child whose learning style didn't match the methods being used to teach him. She'd seen hundreds of children like him during her years in public education, kids who were labeled as problems when they were really just puzzles that hadn't been solved yet. The breakthrough had come during her third week cleaning the Hamilton house. Tyler had been sitting at his father's desk staring at a phonics workbook with the kind of hopeless expression that broke Monique's heart. Without thinking, she'd paused in her dusting to look at what was troubling him. "That looks like hard work," she'd said gently, not wanting to startle him. Tyler had looked up surprised to find an adult who wasn't immediately trying to help him or correct him. "I can't do it," he'd whispered. "The letters don't stay still." Monique had set down her cleaning supplies and moved closer, recognizing the classic signs of dyslexia that she'd learned to identify during her teaching years. "What happens when you look at them? They move around." Tyler had explained, his voice filled with the shame of a child who'd been told too many times that his experience wasn't valid. "Sometimes they flip over or switch places. Everyone says I'm not trying hard enough." "You know what?" Monique had said, settling into the chair beside him. "I think your brain just sees things differently than other people. That's not wrong, it's just different. Some of the smartest people I know see letters the same way you do." It was the first time in months that an adult had suggested Tyler's struggles weren't a character flaw, and the relief on his face had been immediate and heartbreaking. Comment below if you've ever had someone who saw your potential when everyone else saw only problems. There's something life-changing about people who believe in us before we believe in ourselves, isn't there? From that evening forward, Tyler had begun appearing in his father's study during Monique's cleaning visits, drawn to the first adult who had listened to his experience without immediately trying to fix it. Monique had started bringing simple picture books from her own collection stories she'd used with struggling readers during her teaching years, books that prioritized engaging narratives over reading-level assessments. "Would you like me to read to you while I work?" she'd asked one evening, pulling out a worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are. "I used to read to my students all the time. Sometimes hearing stories helps us understand how reading is supposed to feel." Tyler had nodded eagerly, hungry for any interaction with books that didn't involve worksheets or assessments. As Monique had read, he'd begun to relax in ways his father hadn't seen in months, his body language shifting from defensive to curious as he followed along with the pictures and listened to the rhythm of storytelling. "The pictures help me understand," Tyler had observed after Monique finished the first story. "When people just show me words, I can't tell what's happening." Monique had recognized the insight immediately. Tyler was a visual learner, trapped in teaching methods that relied heavily on abstract phonetic concepts. He needed stories with rich illustrations, predictable patterns, and emotional connections that made reading feel meaningful rather than mechanical. David had discovered their informal reading sessions during his fourth week of Monique's employment, arriving home early from a business dinner to find his son engaged with a book in ways he hadn't seen since before the learning difficulties had been diagnosed. "Tyler seems to enjoy story time." David had observed his tone carefully neutral as he tried to understand what was happening. "He's a natural storyteller," Monique had replied, packing up her cleaning supplies while Tyler continued looking through the picture book. "He just needs to see that reading is about stories, not about performing tricks with letters." David's initial reaction had been skeptical. Monique was clearly kind and well-meaning, but she wasn't qualified to address Tyler's complex learning disabilities. She had no advanced degrees, no specialized training in dyslexia intervention, and no understanding of the sophisticated educational approaches that experts had recommended. But Tyler's response to their reading sessions had been undeniably positive. For the first time in months, he was excited about spending time with books. He'd started asking when Monique would visit next, looking forward to their story time in ways that he'd never anticipated his expensive tutoring sessions. "I don't want to interfere with Tyler's educational program," Monique had said, when David expressed his concerns about maintaining appropriate boundaries. "But if reading to him while I work makes him happy, I'm glad to continue." David had agreed, though he'd insisted that their informal reading time shouldn't replace Tyler's structured tutoring sessions. Monique wasn't qualified to teach reading, and Tyler needed professional intervention to address his learning disabilities. What David didn't understand was that Monique's 20 years of classroom experience had taught her something that expensive specialists sometimes missed. Children learn best when they felt successful, confident, and emotionally safe. All the sophisticated techniques in the world couldn't help a child who had learned to hate learning, who associated books with failure, and who believed that he was fundamentally incapable of academic success. Over the following weeks, Tyler's enthusiasm for their story sessions had grown, and Monique had begun to see glimpses of the bright, curious child hidden beneath months of educational trauma. He asked thoughtful questions about characters' motivations, made connections between stories and his own experiences, and demonstrated the kind of comprehension skills that had been obscured by his struggles with decoding individual words. Monique had started to believe that Tyler wasn't learning disabled. He was teaching disabled, trapped by methods that didn't match his learning style and defeated by expectations that focused on his weaknesses rather than building on his strengths. She'd also started to believe that with the right approach, Tyler could not only learn to read, but could develop a genuine love for books and learning that would serve him throughout his life. All he needed was someone who understood that teaching wasn't about implementing programs, it was about understanding children. The crisis came on a gray November morning when Tyler's school psychologist called David with a recommendation that felt like a final verdict on his son's educational future. "What happened next will challenge everything you think you know about learning potential. Mr. Hamilton," Dr. Sandra Williams said over the phone, her voice carrying the weight of professional authority. "We've completed Tyler's comprehensive educational assessment, and I'm afraid we need to discuss some significant concerns about his placement in our program." David had been expecting this call for weeks, watching Tyler struggle through another month of failed tutoring sessions and increasing anxiety about school. Despite the $540,000 he'd invested in specialized education, Tyler's test scores had continued to decline, and his emotional state had deteriorated to the point where he sometimes cried when asked to read simple sentences. Tyler's learning profile suggests that he would benefit from a more specialized environment. Dr. Williams continued using the kind of clinical language that made devastating news sound like professional recommendation. "We're recommending placement at Riverside Academy, a residential facility that specializes in children with significant learning challenges." Riverside Academy was a beautiful campus 2 hours away, where children with learning disabilities lived in dormitories and received intensive educational interventions designed for students who couldn't succeed in traditional settings. It was expensive, evidence-based, and absolutely the last thing David wanted for his 8-year-old son. "Are you saying Tyler can't learn to read?" David asked, his voice tight with the frustration of a parent who had exhausted every option. "I'm saying that Tyler's combination of learning disabilities may be too severe for traditional academic goals," Dr. Williams replied gently. "Riverside Academy focuses on life skills and practical education rather than conventional literacy. It might be more realistic to help Tyler develop the tools he'll need to function independently rather than continuing to frustrate him with academic expectations he may never meet." The conversation had ended with David promising to consider the recommendation, but privately, he felt like he was being asked to give up on his son's future before Tyler had even reached 4th grade. That evening, David found Tyler in the study with Monique, both of them looking at a picture book while she finished her cleaning routine. For the first time in weeks, Tyler seemed relaxed and engaged, pointing at illustrations and asking questions about the story's characters. "Monique," David said after Tyler had gone to bed, "I need to ask you something. Do you really think Tyler can learn to read?" Monique paused in her cleaning, recognizing the desperation in David's voice. Mr. Hamilton Tyler is one of the smartest children I've ever met. He understands complex stories, makes connections between ideas, and asks questions that show real thinking. The only thing he can't do is decode words the way other children do. But the specialists are trying to teach him using methods that don't work for his brain. Monique interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. It's like trying to teach a left-handed child to write with their right hand and then calling them clumsy when they struggle. David stared at her, processing the implications of what she was suggesting. Are you saying the tutors have been using the wrong approach? I'm saying Tyler needs to learn to read the way Tyler learns, not the way reading programs think children should learn. This breakthrough moment shows why sometimes the simplest approach is the most powerful. David found himself asking a question that would have seemed absurd 6 months earlier. Could you teach him? Monique had been hoping for this opportunity for weeks, but she'd also been dreading it. Teaching Tyler to read would require David to trust her judgment over the professional recommendations of experts with impressive credentials and proven track records. Give me 1 week, she said finally. No tutors, no workbooks, no testing, just Tyler and me, and the kind of books that made you fall in love with reading when you were his age. If he doesn't show real progress, I'll support whatever decision you make about Riverside Academy. David had agreed partly out of desperation, and partly because Tyler seemed happier during Monique's visits than he'd been in months. The next morning, Monique had arrived at the Hamilton house carrying a small bag that contained her entire teaching arsenal, a $3 copy of Curious George Goes to the Hospital that she'd bought at a drugstore, along with several other simple picture books that she'd used successfully with struggling readers during her teaching years. Today we're going to discover that you can read, she'd told Tyler, settling beside him on the study's comfortable sofa. Not because you have to, but because stories are too good to miss. Tyler had looked skeptical. Months of failure had taught him to expect disappointment, but he'd also been curious about what Monique meant by discovering reading rather than learning it. Monique had opened the Curious George book and pointed to the first sentence, "This is George." Instead of asking Tyler to sound out the word, she'd read the sentence aloud while pointing to each word, then asked him what he thought might happen next in the story. Tyler had studied the illustration of the curious monkey and predicted that George would probably get into some kind of trouble, demonstrating the comprehension skills that standardized tests had failed to measure. You're absolutely right, Monique had said, turning the page. And look, you just read the story. You knew what the words meant because you understood what was happening. For the next hour, Monique had read the story aloud, while Tyler followed along, gradually encouraging him to read familiar words that appeared repeatedly throughout the book. When Tyler encountered words he couldn't decode, she'd simply read them for him, maintaining the flow of the story rather than interrupting it for phonetic analysis. By the end of the session, Tyler had read 3 complete sentences on his own. Not because he'd mastered complex decoding skills, but because he'd become so engaged with George's adventures that he'd stopped worrying about performing correctly and started focusing on understanding what happened next. I read it, Tyler had exclaimed, his voice filled with the wonder of a child who had just discovered he could do something he'd been told was impossible. I actually read the story. Wait until you hear what happened next. This is why I share these stories. When David had arrived home that evening, he'd found Tyler reading the Curious George book aloud to their golden retriever, sounding out words with the confidence of a child who finally believed that reading was something he could master. Dad, Tyler had called out when he'd seen his father. Listen to this. George was a good little monkey and always very curious. I can read about George. In that moment, David had realized that the $540,000 he'd spent on sophisticated educational interventions had accomplished less than what a $3 children's book and the right teacher could achieve in a single afternoon. 1 year later, Tyler Hamilton was reading 3 grade levels, above his age, had made the honor roll for 2 consecutive semesters, and had developed such a love for books that his father had to limit his reading time to ensure he completed other activities. Monique had transitioned from cleaning lady to Tyler's official tutor, a position that David had created with a salary, that reflected the true value of her teaching expertise. She'd also begun working with other families whose children had been labeled as hopeless by traditional educational systems, consistently achieving breakthroughs that expensive specialists had deemed impossible. The Riverside Academy recommendation had been quietly withdrawn when Tyler's standardized test scores soared, and his school psychologist had requested a meeting to understand how such dramatic improvement had been possible. When David had explained that a $3 children's book and patient teaching had accomplished what $540,000 in specialized tutoring couldn't, Dr. Williams had initially been skeptical. But Tyler's progress was undeniable, documented not only in improved test scores, but in his transformation from a defeated child who hated learning into an enthusiastic student who approached new challenges with confidence and curiosity. The thing about Tyler, Monique had explained to the educational team that had once recommended institutionalizing him, is that he was never hopeless. He just needed someone to teach him the way he learns, instead of trying to force him to learn the way other people think he should. Tyler's favorite quote, which had been framed and hung in David's office, came from a thank you card he'd written to Monique. Miss Monique didn't try to fix me because I wasn't broken. She just helped me find out that I could read all along. Which teacher made the biggest difference in your life? Share your story in the comments. Because sometimes the most important education happens when someone believes in us enough to find the key that unlocks our potential. Monique Johnson proved something every parent and educator needs to remember. Every child can learn when taught with patience, understanding, and methods that honor their individual learning style. Labels like hopeless say more about our teaching methods than about children's capabilities. If Monique and Tyler's story touched your heart and you'd like to hear more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Every week I share stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Until next time, remember, the most expensive education isn't always the most effective education. Sometimes all a child needs is the right person with the right heart, armed with nothing more than a $3 book and an unshakable belief in human potential.